Good night, everyone. So, welcome to this special Friday night edition of Teh Tarik with Walid. Episode 30 is the final episode of season 3. I hope not to do any more episodes for the year, and hopefully, we'll resume in January. Well, hopefully, unless of course a politician calls me up and say, hey Walid, I really want to do an episode with you in November or December, then by all means, I'm always happy to have anybody on. Yeah, but if that doesn't happen, this is the season finale, and so welcome, and we are going to have and I know I always say this, but as I said, I mean it every time. And every time a person accepts my invitation, that person becomes special to me already, right? But this time round, this person is a familiar household name. At least over the past couple of years, this person has become a household name, and that's Associate Professor Jamus Lim. And we have a range of issues to talk about. So if you guys wanna participate, feel free to type in your comments, and I'll be happy to take some questions. So the target is not more than 1 hour, hopefully, and then we'll see how it goes. And I think this is the best attendance I have had in quite a while. So I wonder why. But in any case, so before we begin, I don't think Dr. Lim is here yet. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that today I had the pleasure of having Teh Tarik Gele, and this is something that I have advertised on my Insta story. You guys can check that out. And I do get some requests, not a lot. I do get some requests about, oh, can you feature this in your episode? I usually turn it down because I don't make any money from this. But this time around, because Nasuha is the founder of Teh Tarik Gele. Hi Chiun. Nasuha is somebody who has been watching this show since the first episode. I remember she was commenting during Professor Yaakob Ibrahim's episode. So I thought, okay, I should return the favor, not influence her. And there was no agreement to Gele, so I don't know what Nasuha is talking about. Hi, Dr. Lim. How are you?
Of course, just call me Jamus.
Oh, hi, Jamus. How are you?
All right.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for doing this. I am very excited. As you can see, there are about 200 people watching
Wonderful.
this.
Hi to everyone. Thanks for spending your Friday evening with us.
I think the pleasure is ours. So let's start. Let's get there are 300 already. I think a lot of your followers are watching this as well. So let's get to it. Mass mandates, right? So that's the first one, because that was your big contribution in the past couple of weeks. You have had a few contributions.
Well, I don't know about contribution, but that was the most recent controversy.
Yeah, controversy, contribution, synonyms. Okay, so mass mandate. So why do you think we should relax this, and why this, not the others? Or are you saying we should relax everything as well when it comes to the COVID restriction?
So I think a little bit of context is useful here. When I had posted about this, it was in the aftermath of a parliamentary question that I filed, but actually that parliamentary question was filed at the end of July. So at the end of July, if you recall, we were living in a slightly different COVID world compared to where we live in today. And at that time, it seemed like we were in a process of thinking about broader relaxation mechanisms. So, of course, as you probably know, when we do social media, we have a stock of posts, and we don't necessarily post everything immediately after we draft them. So I kept it, and when I came back from the US, it seemed like it was a reasonable thing to revive this thought about masking or not, especially since when I was in the US, I had experienced a very different approach. And that was really what prompted me to ask the question. If you look in the US, the behavior is completely different from how it is here. And while there are pluses and minuses, I think contrasting the two is actually useful. And in particular, what happens is in the US is you see people exiting a building and then they rip off their masks. So in contrast, I think you and I have both experienced the complete opposite here. Someone enters a building and the first thing they do is they rip off their mask because they've had the mask on when they're outdoors. And I actually think that's the wrong way around. If you think about how it's like in terms of transmissibility, it's far more likely that we end up transmitting indoors as opposed to outdoors. So the entire purpose of that post was to kind of stimulate thinking about, well, are we doing things the wrong way, for one? And secondly, to think about whether we should think more seriously about various relaxation mechanisms if we are truly going to take this entire living with COVID endemic situation a little more seriously.
Okay, why the mask mandate though? Because according to the Straits Times survey, right, for whatever it's worth, I'm sure there are methodological issues or whatever it is, but for whatever it's worth, that is something that Singaporeans are quite comfortable with, and even just anecdotally, again for whatever it's worth, I've heard people who are saying even after the mandate is over, they still intend to wear masks, right? So the thing that it seems to me, and the Straits Times survey corroborates this, that Singaporeans are uncomfortable with is the family gathering, right? The size of the gatherings at home, right? So why not go after that as a first step of normalizing? Why the mask? Yeah.
So because ultimately, if you look at the science, it is indoor transmission that is the most transmissible. So I'm sure if you ask most Singaporeans now, they're very happy with, for instance, or not happy, but they're comfortable with unmasking in the gym. And honestly, if you think about the risks that are associated with unmasking in the gym versus the risks of unmasking outdoors, I would suggest that actually the former is far, far more risky behavior than the latter. And yet we have demonstrated a certain comfort level because we think, oh, what we want is when someone's working out, you want to be unencumbered. At the moment, I think Singaporeans are far more comfortable with unmasking in a more risky situation. And that's what I was trying to prompt people to think about in my post. Are we making decisions on the basis of the latest science, or are we making it on the basis of what the status quo is? And that's what prompted that post.
Right. So you think we are ready for that? As a society, we are ready to move to that? Because even now you see people actually calling for more lockdowns, and some people, I think it's pretty much split, right? There are people calling for tighter restrictions. Yeah.
So in fact, if you look at the survey, you'll see that it's about a minority, about 25% that wants things to be tighter, 25% that want things to be more relaxed, and of course 50% that are entirely comfortable, which is exactly why we're in this Goldilocks situation where we are in between both worlds, right? So now that being said, the purpose of the purpose of this post was more to get people to think about, if we were to move to greater relaxation, what are the things that we should be thinking about? Should we be thinking more about relaxing outdoor masking as opposed to our current stipulations for indoor masking? And that's just one of them. There could be lots of other things that we can think about in terms of moving toward a more endemic world. One of them, for instance, I think, is we should focus less on caseloads and more on just those that are either significantly ill, needing hospitalization, or those that are in ICU. We should be eagle-eye focused on both of those metrics and really let the caseloads fall as they may, because the truth is, if we are going to live with COVID as if it were pneumonia or with flu, I mean, when was the last time you monitored how many flu cases there were in Singapore? You don't, because you know that there are people who are going to get flu, and you just live with that knowledge that there is a risk of getting sick in that way. but you don't hyper focus on it. I think it will be healthy for us as a society, and I appreciate it's difficult. It's difficult because we lived with a zero COVID policy for a very long time.
Right.
So we had gotten very, very comfortable with zero COVID.
Right.
And so now we have to kind of readjust and realign our kind of mental models.
Which the
That's part of
government
the
is doing,
challenge.
right? The government is doing now, right? Trying to focus less on the caseloads and more on the
So
critical cases.
so I think they are. The thing is that there was a transition period where more public education could have been pushed. Before, when we were in this period of phase 2 HA and phase 3 HA and so on, that was the time when cases were coming down. That was the time when it was appropriate, instead of focusing on the cases coming down, to say, okay, they are coming down. What we're going to do is we want Singaporeans to focus less on cases. Let's put it somewhere. I am all for transparency, so it should be posted somewhere on the MOH website. But let's not report the number of cases in the newspapers every day, because that's generally not something we need to know. What we need to know is, are our hospital beds sufficient? Is our are our ICU wards being overwhelmed? Those are the critical ones. And as long as those are okay, then we are living with COVID as what the government wants us to do.
Right. So perhaps just final one on this, because there are a few comments on unvaccinated elderly and so on. So would living with COVID mean accepting that there will be deaths and that's just part of it? And because either way, it's damn if you do, damn if you don't, and we just choose to accept the option that there'll be more deaths and we live with COVID, but everything else goes back to normal.
So what I'll say is that nobody wants any death, and not least myself. I live with my mother, who is 70 years old. So saying that we will just accept deaths is, of course, not just callous, but also requires you to not think about alternatives. But that said, it's important to understand that there is both a sin of omission versus a sin of commission, right? So the sin of commission is that you allow these deaths, or you impose policies that end up becoming realized as deaths. But at the same time, there's also the possibility that if you continue to have stringent restrictions, and there are people who are not able to make a living as a result, or who are undergoing severe mental illnesses because they are being cooped up without social contact, those are costs too. And so we don't count these, right, as costs of shutting down. So my point is, again, I'm not saying that we should ignore deaths, and every death is not worthwhile, but it's important to understand the trade-offs we are making when we say we want to have zero deaths.
Right. And recessions kill also, right, in the long run, even in the short run, suicides. Last year there was a high number of suicides as well. Okay, so let's leave it at that. But we agree basically either way there are difficult choices to be made, right? All right. Okay, so let's go to the hot button issue today. Well, it's hot button, I guess, in certain circles, right? So FICA, right? So what has just been debated in Parliament for over 10 hours. So now that the government has put up their position...
time flies when you're having fun. 10 hours or 10 hours between friends.
Yeah. So now that they have put up their position, do you feel assured, especially what Min Shan said, but MOS Faisal also said, and he gave a few examples, right? Like a foreign journalist criticizing, I may be paraphrasing, criticizing the PAP. That's not part of FICA. An academic who's critical of the PAP, not part of FICA. And my concern initially, and as a fellow academic, I guess you can empathize as well. Many of my our fellow academics were concerned as well. Like simple things like co-authoring with a foreign scholar, would that be on Singapore politics? Would that be part of FICA? It seems that they have clarified that none of this would be covered under FICA. So are you now assured, or what are your concerns still?
So what I'll say is this. There are if you look at the bill itself, you have the bill, you have the explanatory notes that accompany the bill that is doesn't have the same weight as well, it's not a bill, it's now a law. So you have the law, you have the explanatory notes that accompany the law, which don't have the same weight as the actual codified law, but nevertheless have some explanatory power and some interpretive power. And then you have the policy assurances that come from MHA and so on and so forth. For me, the weakest part is the third leg, right? A lot of these assurances have actually come from policy statements that could change. If you have another government or you have another minister that has a different view on how policy should be done, they are not bound by the previous policy statements. That's why we were pushing so hard to ensure the codification of some of the things that we were provided reassurances for via policy by MHA, but which were not codified. Now, take a step closer to the letter of the law, which is the explanatory notes. There they have some not as reassuring, but modestly more reassuring language, where it says that it explicitly wants to rule out instances where someone inadvertently collaborates with a foreign principal, but it's unintentional, it's just coincidental. So that has weight.
Right.
And that does rule out some of the most potentially unjust outcomes. But nevertheless, nothing is as solid as if it's officially codified in the letter of the law, which is why one of the amendments that the party has pushed under my name is to include explicit language that states that basically what the MHA stated in its public statements into the law proper, so that in future, in specific cases where this is used in a context where it was not meant to be used, there's the possibility of pulling out the fact that, well, look, this subclause says that this was not the intent of this kind of legal language.
Right. So, but wouldn't you say the policy assurances are of different kinds as well? So, if it's said in Parliament during the debate, it has a bit more weight than a Facebook post, for instance, right? So, what was said in Parliament, do you think that at least gives you some assurances?
Right. So that's why we sought to make sure that these were said in Parliament. So once again, Hansard would have a certain weight of evidence in the judiciary that is weaker than the explanatory notes to the law, but nevertheless better than a Facebook post or a MHA statement. So we did want that component in there, but you know, the other part that was still missing and never ended up becoming law was the assurance of an actual judiciary to look at this. And recent developments have shown that the judiciary is both able to exercise a certain degree of independence as well as overturn, or at least partially overturn, a ruling originally by the ministry. So I think that underscores why we felt it was really important to not just have a tribunal, which of course is better than not having any kind of secondary check and balance at all, but we wanted something that was potentially richer in the form of a judiciary, and we felt that the counter argument, which was, well, there was the possibility of a leak, was insufficient, at least. We felt that there were mechanisms, Hurting Rule, my Sengkang colleague, explicitly said, to have it in camera. So it could be confidential, just that it would nevertheless be an official judiciary. And as far as leaks go, well, look, you know, of course, a smaller number of people is less likely to leak, but the size of a judiciary, honestly, a court proceeding held in camera isn't that much larger than a tribunal. So we thought that was a better balance.
Right. So I personally agree with you, and I think we are ideologically aligned on this, right? However, would you agree that this issue, right, is not really controversial for many Singaporeans, FICA is not really the concern of many Singaporeans other than a small group of activists, academics, and people who are more liberal, quote unquote. Whereas you do not see the same kind of pushback against FICA when it comes to COVID policies, for instance, or even the presidential reserve presidency. You saw that a lot of people were really unhappy about that. But when it comes to POFMA and FICA, people do not really, no, I wouldn't say they don't really care, but they think that this is not something that I will be personally affected, I would be personally affected by, and therefore I do not really put a lot of weight on this.
So there is some degree to which that's true, that it certainly it doesn't directly affect, FICA especially, does not directly affect the average man or woman on the street, right? It's the law itself is meant to be applied only to people that have been classified as politically sensitive persons, and we have sought to expand that coverage in part because we feel that there was both the judiciary, the bureaucracy, as well as political entities that were potentially susceptible to influence. But nevertheless, it is a small group of people, but this is where we think that it matters more to the average person, and that is the effect that it has on our willingness to engage in free-spirited political discussion and political debate. To be quite honest, I know it sounds a bit ironic, but I'm not big into political debates.
Oh, really?
No, not at all. I actually really like to talk about policy. Inevitably, a lot of this gets rolled into a political debate.
But can you differentiate policy and politics? I mean, policy is the outcome of politics, right?
Well, I would like to, and here's the reason why. Because for me, if you always hinge a given policy to a political party, then you become stuck on in a camp, if you will. And at some point, you stop thinking about whether the policy actually makes sense, and you just say, well, I'll let the party or whatever is my affiliation, political affiliation, do the thinking for me. And that's very intellectually lazy. I would much rather say, no, look, let's divorce policy as much as we can from parties. Of course, in the end, a given policy may become championed by one party or another, but let's not have this array of policies that we immediately associate with a party, because then we run the risk of supporting policies that don't make sense just because they happen to have been adopted by a particular political party, right? So one example is just how we, let's talk about masking again. I hate to go back to this, but
it's okay. Yeah.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence that masking in general, and especially indoors, is an important mechanism to prevent the transmission of COVID. I'm a strong believer in masking in general, especially indoors. So, but in the US, for instance, it has become associated with the policy on masking has become associated with a party.
Right, and the culture war, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and not masking has been associated with another party.
Right.
And that's when I think it's destructive. When we want to have rational policy debates, we should base it on the policies as much as possible, so that we can be sure and reassure ourselves that we aren't blindly supporting a policy just because it happens to be something that our party supports. And I would encourage every Singaporean to think this way, which is why I very much always welcome critique of any kind of policy that I put forward. Because really, the truth is, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I have a view. I try as much as possible to be informed about my views and to be responsible about how I share these views. But nothing makes me happier than to have someone engage and question the premise of what I'm sharing, and if necessary, with additional data and information, I change my mind.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think just to end this part on FICA, my personal view is, I think most from my own observations, most people are actually okay with FICA or comfortable with it, just as they were with POFMA. However, if it is used, if people perceive it to be used in a political way, quote unquote, then the legitimacy for the policy would decrease substantially, or for the law would decrease substantially. So how the
Yes,
government?
but that's actually a difference, right? So you said the legitimacy of the policy would diminish. That's probably true. If it's ever abused, people would lash out against it. But it has become law. So
Yes, exactly,
even
exactly.
if
You're right.
it's no longer
You're right.
legitimate in the eyes of people, it's not that easy to overturn the law.
Sure, it is not that easy, but there would be more repercussions for the ruling party, right, at the ballot box or whatever it is. And I can think of Professor Tambaya when POFMA was invoked against him during the elections. I remember that a lot of people were unhappy, even people who were not unhappy when POFMA was passed, right? So I guess that's the distinction that we made. So thank you so much, and let's move on. And if I were ideologically aligned to you in the previous question, perhaps in the next question, we would have some disagreement, and the spirit of whatever you just said, critiquing and challenging, right? So let's talk about the GRCs, right? So on this, I am more aligned to the PAP's policy, right? Because I understand the Workers' Party doesn't want the GRCs to exist, right? As in, you would want a return to the SMCs, right? But as we have seen as a society from the rise in racist incidents, right? Or no, the rise in visibility of racist incidents. Do you think it is wise for us to revert to SMCs when it is clear that there is still a lot of racism, or at least there's some racism, and there's some racial tensions, some xenophobia, whatever it is mixed with racism, and therefore there wouldn't be a safeguard against racial voting or even racist voting if we abandon the GRCs? Yeah.
So here I'll go back to the debate that occurred in Parliament in a slightly different context, which was about the ethnic integration policy for HDB flats. And there, Pritam's response to that was actually he accepts that we aren't there yet. We aren't in a post-racial society, and the incidences of racism continue to exist. But his, and in fact our position on the ethnic integration policy is that that is something that we want to work eventually to. Nobody imagines dismantling the ethnic integration policy tomorrow with no replacement for it, because we know that ethnic enclaves are a social scientific reality, and there's quite a lot of empirical evidence that favors the formation, even with very, very mild conditions of ethnic enclaves. So the problem is there's no doubt. Now, why the Workers' Party, with regard to the ethnic integration policy, has an issue is because it now makes one group, typically minorities, and between the minorities, typically Malays, bear the cost of what we want society to have, which is a more integrated society, ethnically speaking. So by the same token, this is how I think about the GRC system as well. It is true that we haven't arrived at a post-ethnic or post-racial society where we can say, let's do away with the GRC altogether. But we also recognize that the GRC has non-trivial costs in terms of needing to gather a certain number of high caliber candidates in order to have a successful run, competitive run in the GRC. And so here, maybe what we need to ask ourselves is are there transition policies to help us get to a point where we can all be represented by SMCs? And just like how it is for the ethnic integration policy, we have some ideas for potential tweaks to the system in the interim to help us get to a post-EIP world. We would have certain arguments for how the GRC system can be made less pernicious in its operation, well, not least by reducing the very, very largest GRCs, right? To make them something like a 2 or 3% GRC. If you really require representation, have a 2 or 3% GRC, and some of these would require a minority representation. So there you ensure that the slate that you put forward for the GRC is more likely to be competitive. Because it's not as difficult for opposition parties or parties without the depth of resources to be able to fill these positions.
Right. So I definitely agree with you. I think I've been on about 2% GRCs for the longest time. So I just wanted to push you a little. What does post-ethnic society means to you? What does post-racial mean to you?
Well, maybe I should start by saying what it shouldn't mean. So, and a little bit of context is useful here. Of course, I grew up as a member of the visibly ethnic majority. I say visibly because I'm.
Oh, I couldn't tell. Sorry.
Yeah. So I say that because I'm Peranakan, so I'm in a sense ethnically mixed to begin with. But that being said, I lived as an ethnic minority when I was in the West, in various Western countries. So I've become very, very sensitive to the fact that if you live as an ethnic minority, the fact that there aren't loud or vociferous complaints about your treatment as an ethnic minority doesn't mean that all is fine and dandy. So that's the first thing I'll point out, which is that just because we haven't heard loud agitations, except perhaps by some of the most vocal ones, especially online, it doesn't mean that the average minority in this country, whether Malay or Indian or Eurasian, does not feel somehow the pressures of being a minority. Now, some of that is normal. If you're a minority, there's nothing wrong per se with being a minority, as long as that minority status isn't accompanied by specific expectations or specific costs. And that's why I mentioned earlier on, Malays, for instance, shouldn't be the ones that bear the overwhelming burden of our positive ethnic integration, the positive elements of our ethnic integration policy. So to answer your question now, how do we eventually get there? I would say that these are the kind of things that we get there when there's open dialogue, open conversation about what minorities in particular continue to feel in our society. So rather than a sweeping of issues under the carpet and pretending like they don't exist, we need to talk about it. We need to ensure that there is that those that talk about it do not get into trouble. They feel comfortable sharing about their minority experiences and so on and so forth. And eventually, much as I hate to say it, I think it does happen generation by generation. Hopefully the generation isn't like 40 years and more like 10 years.
That's a biblical generation.
Yeah. So, and the reason why I say this is because I think you see this, right, in terms of mindsets with regard to various things. Some of it may be gender roles in society or gender identities in society. And, my mother, for instance, she will, I think, for the rest of her life, bless her soul, not be able to let go of certain mindsets that she has about gender roles and gender identities. But by our generation, we have become much more comfortable with saying it's fine for a woman to work, for instance. And likewise, for the next generation, you can imagine ethnicity being potentially less of an inherent, I wouldn't say it's not a distinction, it will always be a distinction, but less of an inherent bugbear than what it would be if we were not able to talk about it, if we were not able to freely recognize that there are these barriers that still have to be overcome.
Right. So what I would say is I'm not sure whether the post racial society should be a virtue to be pursued or an ideal in the first place, because as somebody who even without people knowing what the race on my IC is, since a young age, people have always reminded me that I'm Indian, right? And if that happens and we do not have safeguards in society, I mean that does worry me as a minority, right? So I am definitely for open dialogue, but I think having things like the GRC and the EIP, even though they come with certain costs, I think ultimately, again, just like earlier, right, there is no perfection this side of heaven, right? So you will always have trade-offs for the various policies. Yeah, but thank you for that. That was a really useful. I think you discussed the philosophy and then get right to the policy as well. So that was a good discussion. So let's get a bit personal, if we may.
Sure.
So I'm sure you've seen these criticisms. You've heard
Let me
this
just check that
yourself.
my wife isn't around. So yes, okay, there you go.
Okay, so I'm sure you heard these criticisms and you've read them before, that people say you're an elitist. And I myself was, during the debate on minimum wage, I was a bit uncomfortable when you mentioned the folksy wisdom comment, and it appeared to be I understand where you're coming, even though I do agree, I'm for the minimum wage. But when you mentioned it, I myself was a bit uncomfortable about whether this was too elitist or too condescending. And people have said that about you in other areas. Of course, a lot of these are online trolls and so on. But I've also heard well-meaning people just asking, I'm not sure about Jamus's demeanor, for instance, right? So how would you respond to these types of criticisms?
Well, with regard to the specific incident of using folksy wisdom, to be quite honest, that was directed in particular at union leaders, which themselves are, one could argue, elite. So
Right.
I think
Right.
I think one has to be very careful in
Right.
pretending like I was referring to the regular man on the street. Don't forget, we are ultimately the Workers' Party, and in fact, we pride ourselves on connecting with the average worker and the mindset and the thinking of the average worker, as opposed to the mindset and thinking of union leaders, which, at least in the Singapore context, have not always been, we might say, have not always been fully aligned necessarily with the mindset of the average worker, at least based on our conversations with non-union leaders and the average worker. So that's the first point that I should point out, which is that I was referring to union leaders, which aren't exactly the proletariat, if you will. And for me, I think that anyone that knows me will recognize that I really don't draw these kind of distinctions between people. And I know that this sounds unconvincing because I'm just stating it, but let me put it in practical terms. If I was after I graduated from A levels, I had an opportunity to continue on in education in a number of paths. One of them was I had place in NUS. So after I finished military NS, I could have gone on to NUS to do economics there. I had an offer from UCL. So this is a university in London. Or I could have gone on to what I eventually chose, which was the University of Southern Queensland. It's what sometimes people call directional university. When the name of the university has a compass direction to it, that's so it's Southern Queensland, right? So it's a directional university, which, if you will, is a neighborhood university. And the thinking in my mind wasn't actually, well, if I go to this school, I would deviate from this elite path. It was more, well, what made the most rational sense at the time. And it was the fact that when I was in the army, I had already started taking distance education classes with this university, such that by the time I ORD'd, I had about a year and a half left with the degree. So I could hentak kaki and start off again in NUS or UCL, blow another ton of money, or I could just finish it off and not worry about the elitism of the university that I went to. The same happened for the PhD. I had, after I finished my master's, which was in the UK, I had the option of staying in the UK to do a PhD. I could have done it, a PhD in Warwick or Nottingham, and I had another MPhil offer, which will not be the PhD, but it will be a stepping stone toward the PhD from Oxford. And I could have gone those routes, but I really wanted to go to the US. And I chose to go to another non-brand name university. So economists have this term, it's called review preferences. It's basically a $50 word for you put your money where your mouth is, right? And at least in this case, I think, demonstrated that I don't need that brand identity, the elite identity, to define myself. And so if I have not decided to have that define myself, hopefully people don't think that it is something that defines me.
Right. Okay. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right?
Yes, that's
And
another way to put it.
right. Yeah. Right. So I mean, there are a lot of, I know, tongue-in-cheek comments on Raffles and ACS, but that's a debate for another day. We only have 13 more minutes, so I don't.
Well, the only thing I'll say,
Yeah.
the
Okay, carry
only
on.
thing I'll say is about that is that, to be quite honest, having been in that rivalry for a very long time, I actually am not offended by someone from the other school making a statement like that in jest. I don't take it seriously. For me, what was, I think, and ultimately I think what bothered more people with that statement wasn't the lousy school bit. I think most of us take it in our stride. It was that in spite of all the claims that schools don't matter, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. In their review preferences, in their quiet moments, they demonstrated an elitist mindset.
Right.
So,
yeah. So I was gonna say, I think I saw more unhappiness over that statement than over FICA, for instance, in general society. Yeah. So not in select groups. Maybe that tells us. So I remember Syed Sadiq, he was telling me, Malaysians tolerate arrogance less than corruption. So I mean, there's something to be said about that, right? When people in power display that level of arrogance, or they seem to, they are perceived to be displaying that. All right. So we only have about 10 to 12 minutes, right? Because Jamus has to go on walkabouts tomorrow, right? Tomorrow morning, Saturday morning.
Every Saturday morning, we don't interact as much these days with people because we are trying to keep our interactions down. But yeah, every Saturday morning we do our walkabouts.
So this is door to door, or is it at the
No. So the
food
house
center,
visits we have suspended.
Right.
Likewise, we have suspended our coffee shop visits, but
Right.
we walk around the estate to make sure that municipal things are running and standards are being kept up.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So what is a realistic target for WP in the next general election? Is it enough to say that you're a check and balance, check and balance. For how long are you going to be a check and balance, right? So are you here today going to make a bold statement and say, next next election, we want to penetrate the two-thirds majority. We want to get at least one-third
So,
of
so
the
the
seats.
first thing I'll say is, we need to obviously hold Sengkang, which is my responsibility with that of my other three MP colleagues. So that's among the four of us, that is the thing that we are focused on primarily. And that's our responsibility. But separate from winning, the reason why winning would be important, because would mean that we have been doing a good job in our respective divisions in Sengkang, and thereby rewarding the voters that put their faith in us. So we want to do that, our responsibility to our voters in Sengkang that put us there. So that's that I will say. I think it's no secret that the Workers' Party has a medium-term goal of accomplishing a third in Parliament. A third is a significant number of seats.
It is. So is that medium term in the next 5 years, or?
Well, if we will see. What I'll say is this: every seat that we put candidates in for, we do the best we can, and we're in it to win it, right? But at the same time, we know that we're up against incumbents that are no pushovers, and we recognize that, and we put up the best fight we can. And if in various constituencies that we compete in, the voters think that we represent a good alternative voice, then we will be able to get closer to that one-third majority. Honestly, if you ask me, if we get to that one-third majority in the next election, then we would be completely ecstatic. If not, it will still continue to be our medium-term goal. That's what we're working toward. Not least because we think that it would deny the kind of I don't want to use the word flippant, but less considered exercises of supermajority that came from what we just saw with FICA, where a bill that has wide-ranging implications was advanced and passed in a matter of 3-4 weeks. And notwithstanding what Minister Shanmugam said about how there had been a 2 or 3 year process of public consultation, sure, about the general principles, but about the bill in particular, we saw that a month ago.
All right. So that's a yes, I suppose, the answer to the question. I'm looking for a headline, tomorrow. So Jamus says we can win one. So I guess I'm not getting that. Yeah. Sorry.
It is an assurance that we will do the very best we can. And, honestly, that's what politics is, right? You do the best you can, but it's not like in a sporting match where you're either going to achieve a personal best. It's not even a sporting match where you will be better than your opponent per se in how you do. It is a sporting match where you don't just have to be better than your opponent, but people have to believe that you are better than your opponent and vote you in. So it's the degrees of separation are so far that I think it would be very presumptuous for us to assume that we will win a fixed number of seats.
Right. So there's an interesting comment by Ashraf as well. First of all, he says WP is doing well as an alternative voice, and he says, please don't dilute the quality of WP MPs. And I guess that's quite important, right? Because if you are too focused on the numbers, then you may start thinking that, okay, let's just fill whoever it is, right? But so far, WP has been very considered in fact, I would say in many ways too considered. People have been telling me, it's harder to get interviews with WP members, MPs than even PAP MPs, right?
Here's a public call. one of the biggest challenges we face, of course, is high quality candidates willing to step forward and put their hat in the ring and say that I'm willing to take the risks as they come, enter the political arena, and serve the country that way. And serve the country in a way where it's not a tournament that you know you're gonna win, because if we achieve our medium term goal, we will still not be in government. We will
Right.
still be just enough of a minority that we can deny, constitutional changes willy-nilly and so on. But we will still be a minority, so you won't have that kind of a possibility of a carrot that dangles that you will one day become prime minister.
Right.
But what we can guarantee is that you will help advance what we believe to be an important cause for ensuring that we have a democracy and a society that better reflects the diversity of views that we need to succeed as a 21st century advanced modern political economy.
Right. Thank you for that. So, just now you said, so this is a final substantive question. Okay. So you said that ultimately you are the Workers' Party, right? Do you think that is still true, or is there a movement towards becoming more woke or capturing the more politically liberal, right? Because the workers, the base, right, is perhaps economically left, but it's not politically or culturally left, right? So maybe the distinction between somebody like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, for instance, right? So is the Workers' Party moving more and more towards the more socio-politically left rather than the economically left?
We move where we think we best represent the left of center in the voting base that we are trying to appeal to. And that is still very much hewing very close to the center, just somewhat to the left. We are, we like to think of ourselves as the fact that PAP is WP light, right? So that's how we think of our position in that political spectrum. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that we don't take some of these so-called woke or far left concerns seriously. And I would say this especially when it comes to issues where it comes down to a matter of human rights, for instance, or individual flourishing. I think that the politically safe position, which is, well, let's wait till the population comes around to it. We have never been comfortable with that when it comes to what we believe to be fundamental human values and rights, right? We don't say, oh, look, Indians are only 5% of the population, and so let's wait till the other 60 or 70% of the population feels comfortable having Tamil as our fourth national language before we do this. No, we said they are a significant minority. They were part of our nation building efforts, and they deserve to be recognized as one
Right.
of the core contributors to our nation. So we have never shied away from taking the potentially unpopular but correct positions on things. And as the minority party, we certainly don't have any say in shifting the direction of policy decisively in any direction. But what we can say is we try our best to be the conscience of the nation in things that we believe strongly about. So that has included, for instance, pushing for anti-discrimination laws to be passed that cut across all potential divides, right? We ask for no discrimination, not just on the basis of nationality or ethnicity, but even for gender and gender identity. So we believe that there should be equality in terms of when you're trying to look for a job, that you should not be discriminated on any of these dimensions. And I think that is the morally defensible, the ethically right position to take. And I think that we're not being more woke by taking a morally correct position. So that I will say that I don't believe that we are moving far to the left in the vast majority of things. But in certain things, I do hope that we can be in a position where we can take the ethically defensible position.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much. That was really a stimulating session. So final question in the spirit of conciliatory politics, right? So who is your favorite PAP MP other than SM Taman?
So I am obviously the ones that sit close to me. I have a very amicable relationship with them. So Yip-Hong Wing and Don Wee, they sit right beside me. So and then Fumi Har sits in front of me. So we have reasonably amicable relationships there. Gantian Po, who is the MP for Fernvale, so I send him a lot of cases when they mistakenly reach out to me. So,
right.
So those. I actually really like Tan See Leng, in how he carries himself, the way he approaches.
he's so impressive in his answers as well.
Yeah. So the one area where I have not been as comfortable in, and actually I think his discomfort also shows, is when he tries to kind of be a bit more on the attacking side. I don't think it suits his personality, and I don't think it adds value to what he brings to the table. What he brings to the table is a wealth of experience, especially in the private sector, a very sharp mind, both, of course, in his trained profession, which is in medicine, but also in terms of his approach to thinking about public policy.
Yeah.
So in all my conversations with him, I've often really enjoyed them, and I've never felt, at least in the members' break room, I've never felt that there was a partisan divide. We always focus on policy issues when we talk about things, and of course, more recently, it's often been about COVID. And I understand the challenges that they face when they are rolling out COVID-related policies, and I think it's valuable even if I disagree. It's valuable to be able to understand and empathize the kind of challenges that they face, because after all, they are in government. And maybe a closing thought that will be useful is this: look, as the Workers' Party, we always propose what we believe to be the best alternative policies. But ultimately, we want the nation to succeed.
Absolutely.
If by proposing these policies, we sharpen the policies of the ruling party such that we end up in a better place than we were in the past, then I think we've succeeded.
Right.
Even if we remain as a minority party, as long as this nation, this boat that we all live in, continues to drive toward the sunset, if you will, the metaphorical sunset, and we're all rowing in the same direction, even if some of us row to the left, others row to the right.
Half step to the left.
Half step to the left, a half dip on the left. I think in general, that's what we want. We want the nation as a whole to succeed.
Right, I think that's such a beautiful conclusion, right? A successful PAP means a successful Singapore, right? Well, a successful opposition as well, I think means a successful Singapore. So on that note, thank you so much, Professor Jamus Lim. I know it's very late. You have an early and long day tomorrow, and it's the best views I've ever gotten. The most vibrant chat I've seen and a lot of trolls as well, but that's par for the course. I'm sure you're used to it. So thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Walid.
Prof. Okay,
Wonderful.
thank you so much. All right. Bye bye,
Take care.
everybody. Good night.